I'm going to have several things I'm going to talk about. First is what I call tips, tricks, and strategies of research. Because as I look out into the audience, the majority of you are starting your careers. And you're intelligent, you're well trained, but research is not so easy sometimes. And there's lots of tricks and strategies that we use to be successful. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in the second half of my talk. The first half, I'm going to go into some history and philosophy, because that's something I enjoy. And then lastly, which is going to be sprinkled throughout, are what I call Mike's heroes. So instead of saying mentors, because not everybody I'm going to mention is a mentor in exactly the term mentor, meaning someone you work with. But one of the things I've discovered is that you can learn from lots of people, people that are alive today, people you've met, but also people from the past. And so I'll talk about that. So that's today's talk. So part one, research is the heart of science, engineering, and technology. And what I mean by that, if I dare use this thing, that science, engineering, and technology overlap in a very interesting place. And that zone, and you can see I've drawn it here in different ways, is research. Science is basic knowledge for its own sake. So I was trained as a geologist. I got my PhD here, and so it was basic knowledge. And for the joy of knowing things is to me what science is all about and makes it so exciting. Engineering is the application of science, solving technical problems. And most of my career, although I was trained as a scientist, is in the engineering field, because I went to work for the U.S. Geological Survey in the hydrology group. And they were totally run by engineers. And few of us who are geologists, like Larry, Kirk, and I, we didn't care for a lot of these engineers that were in charge of things, because they had their engineering mentality, as we called it. And so we were constantly in this zone clashing with engineering. On the positive side, though, hydrologists, which are engineers, we learned a great deal about hydrology in the engineering field. And then, of course, as Scott mentioned, we discovered environmental engineering. And so that was the application of a lot of our scientific work. And then the last area of technology is using science to build devices, instruments, and software. And I would say over the last 15 to 20 years, Imma and I have been heavily involved in this area. When I worked for USGS, we really couldn't collaborate with industry very well. It was frowned on, although I did do it with companies that made the pesticides that we were working on. In the 1990s, I had a stretch of about 10 to 15 years where we studied those things. We looked at pesticides in surface water, groundwater, air, and that kind of thing. And we did do some technology, but now it's very easy at the university to have that interaction. And then the last thing I want to put up here is that math is the background to all three of these. And I know in engineering, you're well trained in that area. I was trained as a geologist. The reason scientists go into geology is they don't like math. They're afraid of it. And so you become a geologist because you never spend any time there. And I thought I was going to be a field geologist. That's what I wanted to do. But it turns out that structural geology was just beyond me. I just stumbled and struggled. And so I ended up in chemistry instead, which I've been very happy with. So what are the products of research? Well, in science, research papers tend to be one of the main things that we work for. The basic knowledge. It can be textbooks, research papers. Engineering, we go for solutions, treatments, models, the methods. And in technology, instruments, software, and patents. And Imma and I are collaborating with one person here at the university, and he said to me the other day, I don't care about research papers. Now, this person is well beyond that. He's probably got 500 papers. He goes, I want patents. And so I've never thought about it that way. We do have one patent, but not many. But the technology folks, they're big on this. And probably I should have drawn my circles that technology and engineering overlap much more than I've drawn them here. But for artist's sake, I drew it like this. And then I would like to throw out an idea, one of my tips, so to speak, is simplicity and elegance is really what I define as the art of research. And this is what we struggle for, is to be simple and elegant at the same time in our experiments, in our papers. That should be the goal. And that's what moves the soul, so to speak. That's what keeps some of us going even after retirements. You retire from one job, you start another. Some people don't stop, and I have examples of people like that that I'll talk about today. So when I started preparing this talk, I've given various forms more about how to write a paper than how to do research. So I went to Wikipedia like everybody, and I found this boring diagram. And it says, and really, if you're writing a proposal, this is pretty much the path you follow. You state some kind of a problem, you formulate a hypothesis, done an experiment, collect data, analyze data, draw a conclusion, maybe you go around a second time, and you write a paper. And the funny part is a lot of times people start here and say, well, I've stated the problem, now I'm going to write a paper. I don't know how many times I've heard that. And we haven't even collected any data yet. I'm going, really? You're going to write a paper and you haven't collected any data? So I thought, well, there's got to be, how do we do it? You know, how have I, looking back 30, 40 years, how have I been doing it? Not like this. And so I stumbled around and I remembered a book, many I've read. So here's one of my first heroes. Richard Feynman won the Nobel Prize 1968 for quantum electrodynamics. He was a theoretical physicist. He also solved the problem of why the Challenger crashed in 1988. He was on that committee. He died shortly after that. I think he died in 1989. But his idea, his formulation for research goes like this. Now remember, he's a theoretical person. We're experimentalists, and in engineering in general, that's how we work. His idea was guess a new law or a new theory, compute the consequences of your guess, and compare these computations with experiments or observations. If you want to be entertained for 10 minutes, every one of the students, write down this website. It's real simple, richardfeynman.com. There's a 10-minute video where he explains this. And I've watched it several times. It's really fun to watch. It's interesting. And he actually explains two things: the scientific method and the unscientific method. And today, with all the fake news, you might want to see the side of what he describes as an unscientific method. It's actually very fitting today. You know, what is fake data, or what is fake knowledge? What are fake experts? He talks about that in his 10-minute video. And it was, I think, done in probably the 1960s and 70s. And you'll be able to tell by his white shirt and narrow black tie what professors wore in those days. He was at Caltech. He spent most of his career there. And he's written several books. His memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, is a really good read, worth reading. But what I've noticed is that what Imma and I tend to do in our research as experimentalists is we use these 3 steps, but in a different order. What we'll often do is start here with an experiment or an observation. We say, hey, that's interesting and unusual. I wonder what caused it. And then we'll jump up to here and say, hey, let's guess a new theory or an explanation or law that explains that. And then what we'll do is, instead of compute, we'll go back to the lab, run experiments, try things, and see if we can prove that, and run this around several times. And that has been a very successful technique. And I'll show you some examples as we go along today of some of the students and postdocs that we've worked with where this has worked. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce my second mentor. And this is someone that I'm sure all of you might have already figured out without me saying. The Last Supper was a fresco and an experiment, by the way, by Leonardo, which failed. And chunks of the fresco keep falling off. So it's actually gone now and been refurbished and redone. And I'm not sure where it is at this moment. I think Milan, but I'm not sure. And then, of course, this Vitruvian Man is a famous drawing of Leonardo's. And this is a self-portrait. He lived from 1452 to 1519. And you might wonder why I'm even bringing him up, other than the fact that he was an inventor, a scientist. He would, and I've read several biographies, he would watch people die. He would find someone on the street that was maybe a homeless man and who was dying, and he would stay with this person until he died. And then as soon as he died, he would try to understand what was death. And then he would immediately go through surgery on this person, drawing their components. And, you know, in a time when if people knew that he was doing this, he might have been put to death for this sort of thing. You know, this was a time Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. That was one of the things. Another thing he would do, he would look for the ugliest man or woman, I suppose, in Florence, and then he would draw them, just to see, you know, what kind of shapes. And so he was a very interesting guy. He wrote his notebooks in Latin, which not many people could speak or read. I guess you weren't speaking Latin in those days; they were just writing in Latin. And he would do it in mirror image, so no one could read his notebooks. So I wondered, do you think people were stealing his data? Or was he more worried that if someone read his notebook, he would get in trouble for what he was doing, which I think is more likely. Imma and I, if you ever go to London, go visit the library, public library. They have some of Leonardo's notebooks on display there, the actual notebooks. So that's a cool thing, and it's free too. So that's a fun thing to do. And of course, he worked on engineering aspects, pumping water, drawing maps, making weapons of mass destruction for those days. And I suppose he was funded for his research by doing that in his artwork. And of course, the Gioconda was his most famous painting. And Leonardo, they thought that he started in about 1509 on this painting. And 3 years before he died, in 1516, there was war going on in the Florence area, so he escaped to France. And so I'm trying to imagine him riding on horseback with this painting under his arm, because it wasn't finished. And he finished it right before his death, and the King of France had taken care of him and put him in a chateau in the south of France. And so that is the reason the painting belongs to the French. And it sits in the Louvre, and it's valued at $1 billion, the most famous and most expensive painting in the world. And anyway, there's lots of funny stories about it, but it was stolen. And Pablo Picasso was blamed for it. I don't know if Imma knows that little bit of history. But it turned out it wasn't Italian that stole it, one of the people who worked at the Louvre. And of course they recovered it and got it back. But interesting stories. But what's most important for my talk today is that Leonardo was born at the beginning at the Renaissance period, as also right before the invention of the printing press and the use of paper throughout Europe. Prior to that, most things were handwritten on parchment. And it turned out that paper, of course, had been invented by the Chinese, 1,000 years before. It had gotten to the Middle East, but the church was so powerful in Europe at the time that they wouldn't let paper be used, even though it was known. And they would force people to write on parchment in handwriting. And very strange, because they associated it with the Muslim religion. So paper got held back until finally the printing press broke through, and of course the whole scientific revelation, knowledge, and data being transferred. So the printing press, Europe comes out of the Dark Ages, et cetera, the end of parchment, and now we've been doing this for 500 years. But my point to you here is that you may not realize where we stand today. We are at the verge of an entire new revolution that has occurred just since I started working on my PhD. So my thesis was typed on Xerox 860, And you might say, what the heck is that? It was invented in 1979. It cost $40,000, and the USGS had plenty of money then, apparently. The secretary, I had a secretary as a student. How about that? Right? So you can see how much things have changed. But the IBM PC came out in 1981. Yeah. So basically, this entire digital revolution has occurred in the last 20 years. And some of my key dates are up in the next slide, but I'll just keep going. The World Wide Web, the PDF by Adobe, incredible breakthrough. And so we just keep going on all these breakthroughs. And email. So it turns out, I'm going to embarrass email. So in 1996, we met in Spain, and right at the beginning of email. And so, of course, I'm sitting in my USDS sending emails in 1996 because we had met, but we weren't a couple. Yeah, thanks. So we are part of what you would call a romantic email from the very beginning, 1996. Okay, hey, thank you, Mark. So the World Wide Web, the PDF, the Google, this is one of my favorites. So Google was started by these two guys, Page and Brin, as a garage project in 1998. And now look at Google today. Wow. The Google Library, which I thought was a great thing, was put on hold. They were going to digitize every book ever printed. I think that will eventually happen. It's been slowed out, but it'll happen. Wikipedia, which is an incredible source, that's 2010. Who knows how many articles now? That's an old data point. And then things like the iPad and smartphone. These are all things that we have today. And this is all the tech. So we're at this technology revolution. And I gave this talk 3 or 4 years ago at the Science Library here. It was called The Death of the Science Library. And I changed it here to call Is the Library Extinct? Well, in that talk, I went through things like, the Greeks are one of my heroes. So Imma and I went to the Parthenon, and that's where Western civilization, and especially science, began. And so about 200 BC or so, and things were written on scrolls in those days. And of course, all those scrolls were destroyed. That's another talk. And then parchment and the great libraries of northern Africa, there's a great library there, was destroyed in wars. And then of course, Cordoba, which even I've been there, there's great paper libraries there, very famous. And finally, we get to our library, the Northern Library, and yes, it's going extinct. The only question I missed on my PhD defense, I was so proud, I was so ready, was my advisor said, what's written on the steps on the top of the library? And I go, shoot, I don't know what's written there. It turns out it says, those that know only their own generation always remain a child. So you got to know some history in the past. And geologists have this saying, the present is the key to the past. And this is kind of like what I'm giving is the other side of that. The past is the key to the present too, and especially in science. So this ends part one. We are at this technology revolution, and it's both good and bad. The cell phone, I just hate it and love it at the same time. And everybody knows why. All those emails you don't want to read, waste of time, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things we need to do is to learn how to use technology. And that's where my second part of my talk starts. And this is where it's the tips and tricks of science. And this is one person's point of view. And perhaps Imma would say this is her point of view, but I didn't let her look at the slides, so she may not agree. So I call it the 7 pillars of science. The 7th pillar is the journal article. It's the currency of science. It's the home run, you hope. So what's pillar 1? And I put down here, it's an experimentalist approach. Okay, so that's, and I'll start with Linus Pauling, another one of my heroes. So I got to meet Linus Pauling in 1985. He was 84 years old. It was at the University of Denver, right here, and there were 2 other Nobel Prize winners, whose names I've forgotten. Anyway, Linus was really interesting because he gave a talk, and guess what his talk was? How I did my PhD. And I go, wow, that's cool. And so what he did was, he did his PhD in the early 20s. He was born in 1901, so it was probably like 1924 or 25. Well, Bragg had invented something called X-ray diffraction in 1915. And so this was a brand new tool. So it's the tool. And Linus said, well, I went down to the chemistry department reagents and said, what do you got on the shelf? And they said, well, we have copper, carbonate, we got this, this, and this. So he just gathered up all these reagents, went back, and started running every one of them through X-ray diffraction. In those days, of course, they didn't have computers and printouts. They had photographic paper. And so we'd get all these dots on the page. And so he became the master of the tool, the master of reading those dots. And he used that to write a famous book called The Chemical Bond, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1954 for that work. And he won it a second time for the Peace Prize, and he probably would have won it a third time for DNA, except for one thing. The photographic DNA was in England at the time with Watson and Crick. And Linus Pauling's son went and saw that X-ray dot pattern, which was done by Rosalind something, I forgot her name. She was the one that actually delivered the data and never got any credit for it. That's another story. So, but Linus couldn't see it because his passport had been revoked because he was a peace guy in the 50s. Imagine. So he never saw it. I've read books on this. They said if he would instantly, from his knowledge of the dots, he would have said, I know what that structure is. Anyway, that's Linus. So I have good ground to say the tool is really important here. State of the art, master the tool, develop the method. Step 1. Super important. It's where most of us failed the first time. It's the biggest failure in science. Bad data. Coming from, or not understanding your data to the complete effect that you could. That to me is the weakest link in all of science. And I have 2 stories about that from our own papers. This was one of my early papers on preparative isolation of aquatic humics. There, the tool was something that all of you use today, the DOC analyzer. And we became, it was George Aiken, Jerry Leanhair, and myself. And Jerry taught us how to use that DOC analyzer, and we just worked that thing to death. And as Scott mentioned, a lot of research came out of that, as well as chromatography and the theory of chromatography. We really worked hard on the theory of chromatography. And then the second example is measuring the mass of an electron by L.C. Toff, study of twin ions. And this was a paper that Imma and I did, experimental chemistry, and I give Imma the credit for this paper. She made an observation that we saw a fragment ion on a pharmaceutical that we were studying at the time, that in positive ion gave a mass of 161, and in negative ion gave a mass of 161. And at the time, I thought, geez, that's impossible. How could you put a proton on something and take a proton off and have the same mass? Well, it wasn't a proton, it was about electrons. And so if you have 2 electrons on this fragment ion, you're negative. If you have 1 electron, you're neutral and a radical. And if you have 0 electrons in that outside orbital, you're positive. And it took us 5 years to find an instrument that could measure that difference. And so it was the mass of 2 electrons. It hasn't been cited very much, but it's my favorite paper out of 100 and something. So, step 2, critical thinking. And this, boy, is super important today. Imagine we voted just the day before yesterday, or whatever it was, Tuesday. And critical thinking, not knowing what important facts are. Another hero, here's Richard Feynman again. But now let's focus on what I've written. So, critical thinking. And this leads to the discovery. And you need 3 things. You need knowledge of what you're studying. You need the theory. And calculation is super important in this triangle that forces you to think critically about the problem you're trying to solve. And with that, these are the tips that I would add. Question the assumptions that are being used. Often we read papers and just accept everything that's there. You know, critical thinking involves questioning assumptions, coming up with new ideas as we read those papers, and intuition. This was Einstein's idea, the thought experiment. You know, he never went to the lab. And so I sometimes, if I'm on a long airplane ride, this is what I try to do if I'm by myself, is sit there and think of a thought experiment that you can do with just a piece of paper and a pencil. And this is why memory is so important. And it's underused, especially in today's technology, because you can just look up something. But this is where art comes in. And I almost did this, but I left my guitar behind. But if you ever play guitar, you know that memory is everything. Yes, you can read notes, and I know a few people who can just read and play, but it's rare. Most of us use memory all the time, but in science we tend not to. Imma is my exception. She knows the mass of every ion we've ever looked at. But I try to remember as much as possible. The thought experiment requires memory. And the reason it works is that for some reason, rapid thought is very good on making discoveries. And if you have to go look up something in a book somewhere, you're going to be interrupted before you ever find that number, even if you're looking on your smartphone. Okay, next hero. And this is the hero of heroes. So back in, what was it, 1979, I saw Star Wars for the first time. I was on a field trip for my PhD thesis. It must have been 1978. We were collecting water samples in Florida. And there was this movie coming out called Star Wars, so we went to see it. And it was George, myself, and a couple of others. And anyway, it was a great movie. We had a good time. And over the years, I really enjoyed the idea of the Force. And I think it's real. And it's based in intuition. And so where did all this come from? So I dug into it. Of course, George Lucas never won any awards for any of his movies, amazingly enough. Shows you what Hollywood does with awards. And he created this idea. But who was behind George Lucas? Does anyone know? No. Joseph Campbell, that's who. Joseph Campbell was a professor who wrote a famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he was buddies with George Lucas, and Lucas would invite him up to his ranch, and they would sit and talk. And so Joseph, in this book, this famous book, talks about the 12 steps of a hero. And that's what George Lucas used to write this super famous thing. And it's all about intuition. So something for you guys to look into. I won't tell you the details. Pillar 3. How am I doing? I don't want to run out of time here. I'm good. My next hero was also a hero for Larry and I, and that's Jerry Lee here. He had just finished a postdoc at USGS and had a project as we started. He got me started in DOC, chromatography, and he taught us what I call the one-day experiment. You know, what I see lots of people do in the lab, and I really discourage it, is you plan out this beautiful experiment, you've got 100 samples, you put them on the instrument and shoot them all at once. And they all fail at once because something you haven't thought of. You know, and you maybe have spent 2 or 3 weeks doing this. It's incredibly discouraging. Don't do that. Do the one-day experiment when you can, which means you try an idea, see if it works, you get some feedback, you realize your mistakes you've made, you refurbish, you run again. Jerry was the master of that. He also had Larry reminded me this the other day, that Jerry always had the theory of the day too. So he was coming up with new ideas constantly. We argued and talked in the lab every day. I don't see that happening here. Please, as students, you guys should be talking to each other. You know, leave it at your desk and get together and discuss ideas. You'll learn a lot from your colleagues. And also, you can test your knowledge. You test your theory, your critical thinking. Jerry did that to us. We never wrote a paper together in all those years. We fought about every idea, but I had such a great time. And the reason I put him here, he's holding something that you might be interested in. It's a hat with a hole in the top. So Jerry was also good at building things. He built his own house in the mountains. So he's up there cutting firewood one day, and a thunderstorm rolls in. and he gets struck by lightning. Unbelievable. He was unconscious for 20 minutes. His wife, Georgine, heard the lightning strike, picked up her phone. Jerry didn't answer. She jumps in the truck. He had a big piece of land, drives up the hill, and there's Jerry laying on the ground with his dog dead. She gave him CPR for 20 minutes, and he revived. And Jerry, at 75 years old, is now riding his bike across the United States. What a character, you know? And so I learned a lot from Jerry. Sometimes we'd write a paper on 1 or 2 samples. Other times, we would run as many as 50,000 samples. When I worked at the USGS in the Kansas office, we did 50,000 pesticide analysis. And if you don't think you get some data there, boy, that's a lot of data. And I'm going to point out 2 things of students that I've worked with, but not giving the story, because sometimes it drops in your lap and sometimes it doesn't. Kirby's in the audience. He just got his paper published on chemistry, and he'll be giving a seminar in a couple of weeks. And his story is one of a long struggle to get to it, but it's a cool result at the end. And then the other person I want to mention, who will one day give us a seminar, is Rosa. And I call it Rosa's surprise. She worked very hard in the lab, and one day we shot a sample and something really cool happened. And that can happen in science. And the prepared mind, you know, what's it called? An accident can sometimes, if you're prepared, luck will just strike. Yeah, luck is the word. It's not exactly luck, but it can strike. And so those are things to keep in mind. And they'll talk about those themselves. So now I get to pillar 5, the literature. And you're saying, hey, Mike, what is this? You mean you do all this work before you even read what others have done? I mean, really? Well, okay, so I have some background from experience. I pick up a book and read. But I stay away from the literature, the journal articles, because is it a treasure, some of these journal articles, or is it what I call a broken column? You know, maybe a lot of the literature is quasi-correct, or sometimes it's absolutely right, but the joy of discovery, the literature is not my first step. The joy of discovery is removed if you read the literature first in too much detail. Because you'll say, oh, somebody found out this and this, and then you run your experiment and you find this and this too, and you go, oh shoot, you know, it's already figured out. So don't go there first. Have your joy, and then later find out, oh shoot, you know, I'm not the first one. But still, you're learning how to do it when you do this. You're teaching yourself, and then one day you'll be fortunate. You go to literature and it won't be there. Nobel Prize. I read the book, I forgot the fellow's name because I didn't look it up again, but I remember reading his memoir, the fellow who discovered the replication of DNA. And when he made this discovery, in his memoir he says, well, I figured somebody must have published this. And he had a cabin up in the mountains, and he used to go up there and daydream and work, and that's where he got the idea. He went to the literature, no one had it, boom, Nobel Prize. And now, genetics, and the power of replication of DNA is one of the new, really hot topics. Who are the experts? Is the literature correct? A place for the highly cited paper. That's a whole lecture into itself. And then we get to pillar number 6, the scientific meeting and workshops. And so, as students, you know, and postdocs, it's really important to get out there and meet the experts, and don't be put off by them, you know. And if the expert is too arrogant to talk to you, well, then leave them alone. Who needs them, you know? The people that come and give talks and leave, that's what I think of them, you know. They're arrogant. I mean, why? If you really love science, you'll be there talking to everyone. And so that's how I see experts. So meet those experts. Know their papers before you meet them. If you want to impress an expert, ask them a question about their paper. They'll talk to you for a long time. Challenge them. Don't be afraid to be wrong. You know, don't be afraid to be wrong, because if you're wrong, this is one of the tricks I used to use when I would visit industry, when I worked for the GGS. I would come up with an idea about something, and I would have an audience like this, and I'd throw out my idea. If I was wrong, half the audience would jump up, put their hands up, hey, no, that's wrong, you're crazy. If the audience was totally silent, I thought, got that one right. So don't be afraid. And then build your mentors. Find them where you can get them. And in my case, my PhD advisor could care less about what I did. And so although I got some good ideas from him once in a while, he didn't care about my work. So I went looking other places for mentors, and they're everywhere. In fact, I put up another set of heroes. And the guys out here, maybe the girls too that watch football, will know these two guys, Al Michaels and Chris Collingworth. They're two experts on NFL football. And I love listening to them when they're talking about, because the game gets boring after a while. People bumping heads and knocking each other down. Every now and then there's a good play. But I love listening to these two guys. And so your experts are everywhere in this world. And sport is a really interesting place to look, because sport is so different than science. But it requires incredible skill. And so in some ways, some of that can rub off in your ability to use your tools, because that's where those two come together. And so the last thing is to write the paper. So Kirby knows, because we beat our heads together for a year about what I think about writing papers. And it doesn't matter if you agree with me or not. I don't care. But I'm going to tell you why I do what I do. I always write the title first place I start. And I spend a lot of time on the title. Imma thinks I waste time on titles. I can spend 2 weeks fooling around. I put all the words I can think of that are interesting. I want that title to be something that people in my field just will not pass over. They just feel obliged to read that paper. And that's why. And the abstract is next. You mean you write the abstract next? Yeah, you know why? Because I have another mentor, Bob Dylan. And I go back to the 60s. And one of his lines in his song is, I know my song before I sing it. And I just couldn't forget that line. And so that's how I feel about paper. I don't write till I know my song. And I don't care who tries to stop me at that point. When you know it, end of the story. So abstract is next. You've got to have something in the abstract that is just needed. It can't just be blah, blah, blah. No introduction in the abstract. Only the meat. Figures are next. That tells the story. And to me, a figure should be understandable without a caption. This is where Leonardo comes in. The artist. If you have to read the caption 3 times to understand the figure and study every dot, nobody else is going to do it. That's not how paper should be. Those figures should really talk. And then, of course, the last thing is the journal. John Faraday, famous physicist, had only 3 words for us: work, write, and publish. So I thought about that in preparation. I thought, isn't write and publishing the same thing? Nope. Because the gatekeepers are there, by the way. And who are the gatekeepers? Well, they're the famous scientists, I'll put that in quotation, who sit in the journals and decide which of our papers get through and which don't. I don't know how many times I've tangled with those people. And I've never been an editor, and I don't want to be one. They have an important job, but they're not the bottom line. And we never give up, right, Kirby? And we were rejected 3 times on one paper. And I knew that it was an chemical chemistry paper, and I just wouldn't take no for an answer, and just kept fighting. And so sometimes you have to, but you have to be convinced. You can't just roll over and say, well, I guess it wasn't a very good paper anyway. So having confidence is a really important thing, and that comes with experience, of course. And so some more of my heroes, Isaac Asimov, and I'm going to end it here with a couple. One of his sayings, his quotes, is, the true delight is in the finding out rather than in the knowing. And I think this is the key to research, why it's so much fun, enjoyable. It's the finding out, the know that you got it. That moment is the best. After that, it's a lot of hard work sometimes to get that paper. And then my last one is from Linus Pauling, satisfaction of one's curiosity is one of the greatest sources of happiness in life. Not pleasure, but happiness. So, thank you for your attention.
I had given talks on all the some of the exciting highlights of my research. I was coming back to the same group, and I wanted to do something different. And it wasn't like this. It was, but it was. I called it figuring things out. And I said, what I'm going to talk about is the human, social, psychological history of what goes into some of these papers that I've been a part of, which is totally different than what you see if you read the paper.
Yeah.
Because, like you were sort of saying near the beginning here, you know, there's this ideal picture of the scientific method, which you know, you have a hypothesis, you test it, and so forth and so on. And when I think about stuff that I've done that a lot of people compliment me on, it didn't really happen that way. Part of it was accidental. Part of it, I really didn't have any good ideas. I just sort of did it, and things sort of came together eventually. And you almost hit on, and you should have expanded a little bit on the surprise, really important thing in any kind of research at all. And that you were about to say, I think the prepared mind is the really important thing here, because a lot of people, they get a surprise if they get something they don't expect, maybe in their data, their calculation, or whatever, and a lot of people just go, well, I must have made a mistake, or something's wrong here, and they forget it or throw it out or whatever. And that could be, if you have the right curiosity, you're driven, and you face something like this, what you should do is figure it out, and it may be a whole new discovery.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And you know, in my handwritten notes, which I deviated from, I had some comments on tips and things. And one of those is from pillar number 1, and I give Imma the credit on this one, is the instrument never lies. And your comment is the surprise. Sometimes the instrument tells you something different than what you expected, and you've got to go with it. You know? And the instrument might be telling you that I wasn't tuned properly today. It could be that, or it could be that it was tuned fine, and if it is, then you're saying, then that's a real number, and I have to understand it. That's an important one. And some more of the little tips, I'll just read them off here. Know your tools inside out. That's really important. And choose wisely on the tool that you choose. And I might give an example for engineers. If you don't know, the program Kirby we were just talking about with the MATLAB, yes. Boy, there's a powerful tool today. But that's an example. Be an expert on your tool. Master the tool. Patience is another one. I see a lot of impatience in the lab. Watch the data come off the instrument. This is the surprise again. Most people, they'll load the instrument up with 30 samples and go have lunch. I never do that. I sit there and with that simple experiment of 1 or 2 samples, and I watch every dot come off that, and I still do it. Because that's where the discovery lies. That's the surprise. That's the yes, I got it. Not later to come back and shoot, the first sample didn't work and this happened. No, you got to watch your samples.
Could I just add a little footnote to that? It's a very important point. What I've discovered, because by going to meetings, talking to people, is that it's worse than that. There's a lot of people who they don't know anything about analytical chemistry, whatever it is. They send their samples off to get analyzed.
Somebody else.
By somebody else. It comes back, and they don't have the wherewithal to know when there's a funny looking number in there, what might have caused that, whether it's the analysis or it's a real thing, and so forth. And
you hit on something there that's absolutely correct.
And I stress with people, learn the minimum, something about analytical chemistry, whatever it is, so you can use your critical thinking to examine those results, because anything that you say from those data, however you interpret them, is dependent upon how good that data is. If you don't know how that data was arrived at, you may be propagating errors.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point.
You got any other questions for Mike about the last thing?
Yeah, Julie.
Question. Sometimes when I go back and look at proceedings from conferences 20 or 30 years ago, they will have notes or transcripts of the discussions that went on after presentations maybe there's a clarifying question, but you don't
Yeah.
see that discussion. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the change that you've seen and
Over
maybe
the
what
years?
your encouragement and
Yeah.
words of wisdom are for.
Yeah, one of the things that I have noticed over that, Fernando isn't here, but his advisor,
Mel Sutton.
Mel Sutton. Mel is a perfect example of the old school. In the old days, if you were a student giving a talk, you were terrified because you knew that that audience was going to nail you to the wall. And now everybody's real polite. And so I see that as a big difference because I think all of us should be held to that same standard, you know. And so that's a change that I've seen. And then the last thing, only as a passing comment, if you're interested in knowing more about this, because I've only touched, every one of these could be a lecture to itself. I'm thinking that maybe every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, those who are interested, will look us up in the lab. Even we'd be happy to talk about research, maybe go out for a beer, and do it in what I call the Greek style. We'll drink wine.
That addresses one of the comments that, observations that Mike brought up, is the kind of lack of interaction you see. Everybody gets focused on their bench work and what's going on, and you walk into the lab and people are just very efficient and moving around, but that kind of bringing things together. So that could serve to facilitate those discussions by having people take a break and sit down and just kind of talk about, well, this is what I've seen in general or what I've seen specifically. And I think you could spearhead that.
Yeah, and Imma and I are both open to that. We both, if you see us in the lab, you know, feel free to ask us a question or talk to us about things. And if we're too busy, we can do it another time, but we won't say no.
Well, with that, let's give Mike a